special guest, a scientist and a leading international expert in climate and weather, Dr. Marshall Shepard, who is also a professor at the University of Georgia. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Shepard.
Thank you for having me. It's my honor to talk to you today.
As you know, people see the impacts, on their lives because of extreme weather. But some people still say that, it raises some kind of like skepticism when we talk about it. So what do you think? How do we convince those people that climate change is real?
Well, I think the weather and climate is doing the convincing for us. Thankfully, many of the numbers are actually going down in terms of the number of people that question or are skeptical about climate change. In fact, just recently here in Atlanta, I moderated a session on climate change with Vice President Kamala Harris, and we talked about that it's the kitchen table issues that matter for people. I think for so long, the climate discussion has not connected the dots for people that the price of the groceries they're paying for, or their public health, or the energy or water supply, or even national security are very much tied to climate change. I think people think it's about polar bears or some far off time 80 years from now, but it's in fact about disproportionately certain people in Atlanta being more vulnerable to heat and floods and hurricanes and so forth. So one of the things that I try to do is to bring climate change down to the kitchen table issues that matter, because most people are concerned about paying their bills or feeding their families or their health care, and they don't see climate change as directly related to those things, although they absolutely are.
It's really interesting, Dr. Shepard, when we think and talk about climate issues. In fact, there are, in my opinion, at least like two groups of people who say, one of them say that it's totally up to the governments, it's up to international organizations, saying that, it's all about their policies and there's not much we can do. And the second group says it's actually about personal action, saying that it's up to us to tackle those issues. So what do you think about those two different opinions?
Well, the reality is it needs to be both, but personal action isn't enough. I mean, we can all start driving electric cars and changing our light bulbs. That won't be enough. We have to have large-scale policy action at the national and international level, things like the Paris Agreement, things like new infrastructure bills that include funding for increased EV infrastructure, or engineering with nature, nature-based solutions, or water policy. So it will take the full suite of actions, but we have to have large transformational actions. Individual actions alone are not enough, but they certainly need to be a part of the portfolio. Here in Georgia, I've been involved in an effort for several years called the Drawdown Georgia effort, where a group of scholars from Georgia Tech, the University of Georgia, Emory, and others have been looking at ways to reduce carbon emissions in the state of Georgia. We've identified a suite of solutions. You can go to the Drawdown Georgia website and find out what those top solutions are that will reduce carbon emissions here in the state of Georgia. So those are things that we're doing at a state level. We also have the Georgia Climate Project that are trying to think about things at the state level, or involving businesses and so forth. So it really takes both.
We also hear a lot about, like people in poverty who are the most vulnerable to extreme weather. Can you elaborate on that? How is
I can certainly elaborate on that, because that's certainly the research that some of which I've been doing. The National Climate Assessment Reports, which the U.S. government issues every 4 years, identified 4 groups: communities of color, poor communities, the elderly, and kids. Those 4 groups are disproportionately vulnerable to extreme weather and climate change. Give you an example. Say we have a heat wave here in Atlanta. Everyone's exposed to the heat. Everyone's exposed. But there are certain groups of people within the Atlanta and North Georgia community, or Georgia community, that would be disproportionately vulnerable to those heat waves. And on top of that, would have limited or less ability to bounce back from the stressors of that heat wave. So for example, everyone's exposed to the heat, but only some communities may have adequate air conditioning in their homes, or adequate health insurance if they need to seek shelter or medical attention because of a heat stress or so forth. So that's the concept of vulnerability. It's a combination of exposure, sensitivity, and the ability to bounce back. On top of that, some of my own research has shown that in Atlanta, for example, some people live in the hottest part of what's called the urban heat island. We know that cities are warmer than surrounding areas, but within that hot urban heat island, there are some communities, some of those four vulnerable groups that are disproportionately living in the hottest part of Atlanta.
So, like you're saying that wealthy people can afford things like medical expenses, they can take care of their like property damages and stuff like that, and people who are economically vulnerable are going to experience a hardship, right?
Yeah, let's look at what happens when a hurricane approaches the coast, approaches New Orleans. Uh, if I lived in New Orleans, I am at a socioeconomic status that I could take my family and drive to Atlanta or Memphis for a week and stay in a hotel. And I know that my home is insured. I am resilient to that event. I don't have as much vulnerability, but there are many people in New Orleans that don't have those economic means. If a hurricane's approaching, they can't leave. They don't have shelter, or they may not have a home with adequate home insurance. So they are exposed to less adaptive capacity, and so they are more vulnerable to the event. So that's all we mean. Everyone gets hit by the hurricane, and we're not playing sides. Everyone's certainly vulnerable to the hurricane and is impacted by the hurricane, but there are just some people within our communities that are disproportionately sensitive to the event, whether it's a flood, hurricane, or tornado, and have less ability to bounce back or recover from the event once it happens. We're seeing it right now in Florida with Hurricane Ian in the southwest part of the state. They were hit with a big Cat 4, Cat 5 level hurricane. Many people were impacted, many homes were lost, lives were lost, and so we think about everyone involved. But many of those people in that community are able to bounce back. They have the means to do so, and others are struggling.
And what do you think, Dr. Shepherd, about the role of technology? Because there have been so many discussions about it, whether we need to tackle the issues like climate issues using like technologies, or like is there any other alternative to solve the issue? Because sometimes I feel like we don't really truly understand the seriousness of the issue, and maybe we need to rely on technology as well.
We do. We have to, but we can't be arrogant about technology. We have to understand that it's not always going to be the saving grace. But I do think we know enough about the climate problem that we can address it. Even though I was a scientist at NASA for 12 years, this is not rocket science. We know that increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is leading to changes in our weather patterns, sea level rise, changes in agricultural productivity, disease vectors in places they shouldn't be, water stresses, and so forth. So we know what the causes are. And in some cases, we're going to need technology for different reasons. We're going to need technology for the mitigation side of the solution space, which is how do we reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere? And so things like carbon sequestration, carbon capture, negative emission technologies like we're working on at University of Georgia and Georgia Tech, and so forth. In renewable energy transition, obviously, those are technologies on the what we call mitigation side of the house. But then we're going to need technology on the adaptation side of the house as well, because things are happening. We know, for example, that hurricanes are likely getting stronger. We know that places like London, England, or the Pacific Northwest of the US have experienced heat waves well beyond what people would have expected in those places. And many of those places don't have air conditioning in their homes. And so people are vulnerable and die or experience health outcomes. So an adaptation strategy in a place like that would be to retrofit many of these homes and businesses with air conditioning, or near places that are experiencing extreme sea level rise or storm surge from hurricanes, maybe some type of seawall or buffer system. These are adaptation strategies, but the technology is certainly there in both of these places. We just have to embrace them. We've got to move beyond, as you had alluded to, this idea of climate delayism, this idea that, okay, climate's happening, but what do we do about it? We got to make sure it doesn't cost too much. Well, that's a flawed narrative, because we know that many of the solutions in the new economy and technologies will also be economically viable and create new industry and create new opportunities. So we can't be scared of the opportunity to move away from an economy based on fossil fuels and things that we know. I certainly am understand that sensitivity and that nervousness, because there are a lot of people that depend on those jobs in that industry. But there's a new opportunity that comes along with this new economy that we'll have to transition to for this climate. Again, we don't have a plan B planet. This is the only one we have. So we don't have the option. When our house breaks down, we can go to another home or buy another house. We don't have another planet, and we don't have a plan B.
What are you most concerned about climate change, not only in the US, but also like globally?
Well, I just am concerned because I just think people understand, and now that it probably is a real thing, but I still don't think they get how much their lives are going to be impacted and how it's going to rapidly increase over time. I think the pandemic with COVID showed us this a little bit. I think if you go back and think about the earliest days of the pandemic, people were kind of, okay, this is bad, but how bad is it really going to be? And then things just took off, just exploded exponentially in terms of the number of cases. We can see a scenario where some of the impacts of climate change kind of take off like that. We're still kind of just in the ramp up period. So what concerns me is that we still have perhaps some of this sort of ramp up ahead of us, and what the implications for storms or our agriculture or even national security and public health. I wrote an article in Forbes several years ago, maybe a couple of years ago, saying it's a climate crisis. It's a national emergency. We need a Manhattan Project, Apollo project, Panama Canal level project, a concerted effort in the same way we had a concerted effort to develop vaccines for the pandemic. We need all hands on deck, not piecemeal approaches to address the climate crisis.
I also need to tell our viewers, because some of them might not really know, that Dr. Shepards was the first African-American to receive a PhD degree in meteorology from Florida State, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So tell us about your goals, about your accomplishments you'd like to reach throughout your career.
Well, I'm just a weather geek. I've always loved the weather since sixth grade. My sixth grade science project was, can a sixth grader predict the weather? I was the second African-American to be president of the largest professional society in the U.S. for our field, the American Meteorological Society, and I've been honored at the White House and elected the National Academies as the SEC Professor of the Year here in 2022. So I have all these fancy accolades, but none of that matters. I just care about what I do. I love what I do as a profession. Weather and climate has always fascinated me, but I'm in a position now as a leading expert, I guess that's what they tell me, that my knowledge base and my expertise can be used to help communities like the one I grew up in, just up the road in Canton, Georgia, low to middle income African-American primarily community that may be disproportionately vulnerable to some of these extreme weather events that I've been talking about with you for the last few minutes. And so my ultimate goal is to just take this material, take our knowledge, our know-how out of the ivory tower into the kitchen table issues and lives of people across this country and around the world.
All right, Dr. Shepherd, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Society